Welcome to the Birth Lounge podcast, an empowering space for expecting and new parents to hear candid conversations with experts to learn how to craft their ideal birth. You've got scary questions that you want to stop Googling, and we've got evidence-based answers with data to back it all up. Hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of the Birth Launch Podcast. Today I am joined by Cassidy, who is going to share her Breech hospital birth story with us. So Cassidy, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for joining me. So before we talk about your Breech baby born in the hospital, you already had a previous birth experience, and that was done at your home, right?
Yes. Yeah, my first 2.5 years ago was a home birth. And then my second baby was not. She was planned to be a home birth, but she had other plans and was Breech.
Sure. Okay. So I want to talk about the difference between home birth and your hospital experience, but I'd love to first dive into what is your birth story? So you go back as far as you need to. Maybe it's at the beginning of the pregnancy, maybe it's at the end. Tell us about your birth story. How was it birthing in the hospital, and what did that look like with a Breech baby?
Sure. So we had reason to believe that she was Breech quite early on, like 33 weeks. But at that point, we were like, it's not an issue. And then after each appointment, I had an ultrasound at 33 weeks because they had also reason to believe she was growth restricted.
Okay.
So we did a growth ultrasound. That was all fine, but that's when we found out she was Breech. So then after that ultrasound, we planned one for a couple weeks later to check in, see her positioning. And I think so we had a 33 week, a 36, and then after that I went like weekly to just continue checking her position. She was always Breech. And then so at each ultrasound, I was with midwives, and in Ontario, like midwives are part of the like whole hospital or the whole medical system. So like they're covered by our medical care. But they can't do ultrasounds and certain things. So I'd have to go to the hospital to get an ultrasound by an OB. So at each OB ultrasound, he'd be like, oh, well, looks like a C-section for you. And I never said anything out loud, but I was like, that's not happening. That's not
for me.
Not for me. And I was just like, all right. He's like, well, we'll let you go into labor for like, and then we'll do your C-section. I was like, no. So I would just leave and I'd talk to my midwives about my plan. And we started talking about a vaginal breech birth at that point. And the hospitals will not allow midwives to deliver breech in the hospital. And like it's the hospital's planning. The midwives have the training, I believe. This is kind of what I understand. It is under their scope of practice to deliver breech babies, but the hospitals won't let them. They kind of made a collective decision not to do breech home births, so they wouldn't do that at all. That wasn't part of it. So after having those conversations, we started to make plans about what my like choices were. And at that point, there was a doctor in the hospital local to me that had breech experience. So I met with him. This was at like 38 and 3 days, I believe. I met with him to talk about like what a breech delivery would look like with him. And he was just like, no, you have to be in the OR. You got to be on your back. We want you to have an epidural. And I was like, well, I was like, I have to be on my back. Like, can I be any other out position? And he just said no, because he needed me on my back so he could do the things he needed to do to get the baby out. So after hearing that, I was like, that's not my plan. Like, that is not the delivery or birth I want. That is like a medical breech extraction. And I didn't want a C-section, but I really didn't want that either. So I started doing my own research, and I found a midwife, and her name's Betty Ann Davis. I've talked to her. She said I can say her name. She's amazing. She is the only midwife in Canada who has hospital breech rights.
Wow.
And so she works and lives like 3 hours from me. So I started looking into what it would look like to drive and travel to her to have a breech birth. And when I was looking, I found out that she, at the time of my birth, was only an hour from me, teaching at a hospital to teach those midwives and even those OBs the like art of hands-off breech and upright breech. So I contacted her and I thought it was going to be a couple days. She called me back in like 10 minutes and we went through like what was going on with me and everything. And she agreed to take me on as a client. So I passed her information to my midwives and they did all sorts of like switching and stuff. And that was on a Friday. So I had planned for the next Monday to go to the hospital, meet with her and my midwife, like the new team of midwives, kind of look at the hospital, get to know, because it was an hour away and I've never been there. I had no idea. I've honestly never even heard of the hospital. But I was like, whatever, this will work. And then so we had a plan for Monday. I was actually even going to get an ECV at that point with my local hospital. And then afterwards, I was going to go and visit the other hospital and meet with the new breech team. But Saturday night, I went into labor instead. And I really think like my body knew that like it was safe because I was so scared. Like leading up to her birth, I was like, I'm going to be forced into a C-section because there's nothing. So I think like as soon as I made that concrete plan of like, if I go into labor, this is what's happening, I felt so much relief. And I think my body was like, okay, get this baby out. Like it's time, we're safe, let's do it. So that was very nice that it happened quite quickly because Betty Ann was actually, this is like, I was just around 39 weeks. Right on my due date, she was due to go back to her hospital 3 hours away. So we're like, oh, we have, a week, hopefully the baby comes, or like, I don't know. We didn't really make a plan at that point. I was like, I don't even want to talk about what happens if, you have to leave. So it was amazing that my baby, and she decided she was coming out right then because that really made plans a lot easier. So I went into labor late Saturday night while I was trying to fall asleep. I thought it could be, I kind of got up, had a snack, walked around just to see like if it was real, if it was going to stay. And things kind of tapered off a bit. I woke my husband up because I don't even think we had bags packed or anything at that point. So I was like, I think I might be in labor. We should probably get the car seat in the car, pack our bags, like do the things that most people do a long time ago. Let's do it now at 3 a.m. And then I was like, you know what? Things are kind of going away. Like I'm just going to go back to bed. So that was around 3. I went back to sleep. We slept again until 7. And when I woke up, contractions were still there and they were a bit stronger, but not like bad in any way. Like they were quite far apart. I think they're only like 6 minutes apart. Really easy. But I was an hour away from the hospital and my first home birth, my water broke while I was sleeping and then she was born 5 hours later. So wow. We weren't sure like how quickly this birth could go. So Betty Ann knew that my first was quick. So we had planned that when I thought I was in labor, we would go to the hospital right away because it was winter time in Ontario, which can be unpredictable and crazy. And the traffic leading to, the city is awful. So we're like, it could be a 40-minute drive. It could be a 4-hour. You just literally never know. So when I realized my contractions are pretty consistent, we called my mom to come watch my daughter and we called her midwife to go make a plan. She's like, yeah, come on down. I'll be right there. She did. We ended up getting to the hospital, going up to labor and delivery. And my whole midwife team was there. So there was the breech midwife and then 4 other midwives who were part of my team. And they kind of let me know what a breech birth in a hospital would look like. So as part of their policy type thing, pediatric team needed to be in the room, like on standby. So they were just, right when it came time to, like, the baby was about to be born, they came and just hung out in a corner with their little, like, table. So it was kind of nice. Like, I was definitely at the hospital way too early. Any other birth, like, I would not have wanted to be there that long or at that point. But I hadn't met any of these people before, ever. So it was nice, like, to be able to talk to them and get to know them while I was still, like, able to have a good conversation. Like, at that point, I was, like, joking and talking and laughing between contractions, and, like, during contractions, like, they still weren't awful. I was just kind of, like, doing light breathing through them, but able to pick up conversation quite easily. And it was nice. Like, I was able to get to know all these people quite well. And Betty Ann kind of gave us a whole slideshow program of what breech birth would look like, and some of the things that some of the I don't even want to say maneuvers, but things that she might have to do to help the birth along. So she gave us a good, like, bit of information right there about what we might see and what might happen and all the different stats on breech birth. This is all the stuff that I was supposed to learn when we met with her, but we were doing it kind of in the middle of labor. But it was nice to, it was very nice to get all that information, which I had learned a lot of it on my own, but, like, to hear it from someone who is the only person in Canada who's who can. It was really, really cool to get that information from her. So they were about 5 minutes apart at that point, and so we just kind of hung out. As they picked up, I need to move during my labors, like both births. I walk through the contraction as a way, like I just kind of, like, walk through it. I was like, if I just keep moving, like, it'll be over. It helped me kind of deal with all the sensation. So I just paced that hospital room. They had a peanut ball brought in. They had a like, bathtub. So it wasn't, I wouldn't even call it like a birthing tub, because it was the width of a normal bathtub, but it was like 6 feet long. It was really strange because it was hard to kind of ground yourself. I'm only 5 foot, so, like, trying to figure out how to sit in this giant tub was weird. But I used that tub for a bit. Lots of walking, lots of moving. My husband, when the contractions got too much to walk through, I'd, like, hold on to him. They had a chair in there. There was a birthing stool in there. Like, they brought in everything. I had a lot of contractions in my hips. So, like, just low hip kind of thing. They were awful. Like, it just felt like my hips were in a vice. So my husband would squeeze each time. And that was about the only place I was feeling any pain, is just my hips, which is what happened with my first birth too. I never felt any stomach tightening. It was just hip pain. So, I got in the shower as things got more intense. So we just had the shower head coming down. I was on my hands and knees. My husband was kind of leaning over, giving hip squeezes. And at that point, like, every time a contraction would hit, I'd be on my hands and knees, and I would stick one leg straight back and kind of, like, rotate into a side plank and, like, work, like, just kind of roll back and forth. And that felt really good on my hips, like, loosening them up. And at that point, that's when I was like, I think I'm kind of, like, moving into that transition stage, because it was intense, like, quite intense. I was having a harder time breathing through everything. And then, sorry, I'm trying to, like, work back. It's been a year. At that point, like, I started, like, I'd start panicking when I felt a contraction coming on. Like, you'd start feeling it, and I'm like, oh, it's coming. And then I'd just start crying. And I was like, I don't want this to happen. Like, knowing. So then in my head at that time, I was like, okay, this is transition. I didn't go through that at all with my first birth, because things went so fast. It went from, is this labor, to, like, I'm pushing. So there was none of this, but I was like, okay, this is what transition is. I know this. That means things are moving fast. Like, let's go. So I went back to the hospital bed, and we raised up the back of the bed, and I stacked a bunch of pillows and just went on my hands and knees with my chest resting on the pillows. Um, and that way I was able to still rock back and forth and like stick my leg back like I was doing in the shower. And we did a cervical check at that point, and I was 10 centimeters, but my water had been like the bag had been bulging through my cervix the whole labor, and it was creating so much pressure. So even between contractions at this point, like there was no break. It just I felt so much pressure. And at that point, I did start getting an urge to push. So they're like, all right, like have at her. So I was like each contraction, I would start pushing and breathing out as I did. But instead of just like a breath, it was like a roar. Like I was like roaring out that breath. And finally, after one of like a couple, my water broke, and like the sense of relief, like the pressure was gone, and I didn't realize how much pressure and how much I was feeling between contractions until it was gone. And I was like, oh, all right. So I like flopped over onto the pillow stack, and I was like, I'm just gonna have like a little rest and just like take some time because I feel good. Like I feel I could do anything now, right? So after a few more, I got a couple more contractions, and the same thing, just the breathing down through them. Sure. And at that point, they called in the pediatric team because they knew like, baby was coming soon. So I was facing away from the door, and I wasn't aware of how many people. I'd already given like verbal and like permission for anyone who wanted to witness this to come in, because I wanted as many people to see and learn as possible. So I don't know how many was in there. My husband's like, there was like 20 people all just lined up around the room watching, but they were silent. So like it wasn't like a crazy chaos. Like I wasn't really aware. Everyone, and I had said that, I was like, I don't care who's in there as long as I can't hear them. So the room filled up, I guess, at that point. The peds team was just off in the corner. And then my midwife team was just, on either side of the bed, letting me do what I felt I needed. So I didn't have any directed pushing. They didn't, tell me to hold my breath or switch. I was on my hands and knees, and they just let me do what I needed. And then at one point, Betty Ann was like, reach in and see if you can feel your baby. So I was able to put my hand in my vagina, and like I could feel her butt. And it was very straight. Like, I felt my first daughter, and it was a hard head. And I was like, what? Like, this doesn't feel right. Like, it was a very squishy little butt coming out. Oh yeah, because she was Frank Breech. I didn't mention that, but she, folded in half, so it was her butt coming first. So I felt, after feeling that kind of gave me a little more, you're like, she's right there. So after a couple more contractions, breathe, like the roaring still pushing her out, she started, they call it rumping, when it's their rump coming out. So she was visible from the outside. And there, like, I felt that the ring of fire, it was very intense. And at that point, like, my contractions started stretching out, and they weren't as regular. Like, they were coming before quite like every 2 minutes, but very regular. And then there was quite a long break once her bum had come out, probably to the back of her knees. There wasn't a contraction for quite a while. And then I got one really strong one, and I was able to push her just past her knees, but she was still folded up inside. So at that point, her umbilical cord was out, and they had told me that they want, after the umbilical cord's born, they want, I think it's a 5 minute till the baby's born. So we waited about 4 minutes, almost 5 minutes, and I still hadn't had a contraction. So Betty Ann just asked me if it was okay to do the, she called it the like fundal pressure. What did she call it? Can't remember. Anyways, fundal pressure. So she wrapped her arms around my stomach while I was on my hands and knees and applied pressure down to help bring the baby down. And while doing that, it triggered a contraction, and I like that time I held my breath and I pushed hard because I was like, I'm done. This is taking too long. Like, I'm ready. So I was able to push her all the way down so her legs had come out. So she was just, her arms and her head were up inside still. And it was just from about rib cage down. And she was just literally hanging out. But at that point, they told me her tone looked really low. So she was very pale and she wasn't moving. She should have been trying to like tummy crunches is what they want to see. And she was just kind of like limp. So they did, at that point, I got one more contraction, and contractions again, like were so sporadic at this point. They kind of like just tapered right off. Like, so at that point, I had one more big contraction, and same thing. I held like my breath and I pushed hard and got her down, and they were able to reach in and just swoop her arms out. And then they did a maneuver called they called the Frank's nudge. So because her head's up, they pushed on her shoulders, which brought her head like back and down, and she was out. They passed her through my legs, so I was able to grab her and hold her for a minute, well, briefly. And then at that point, like, she was very pale. Sorry. So she was quite pale. So they all came around and, we were trying to just kind of like stimulate her. And then her cord was cut at that point after they said like 30 seconds. And she was brought to the peds table, which was in the far corner of the room. We had asked about bringing the table closer to bedside, and the hospital said no. This was before before we even needed it, we had asked the hospital if it could be closer to me in case we needed it, and they said no. But it wasn't really my place to fight at that point. I was just happy that I wasn't having a C-section, so I was like, whatever, we won't need it. So we did need it. She had a hard time catching her first breath. Sure. Her heart rate was great. It was high. It was up in like the 90s to 100 the whole time, but she was struggling to get her first breath. So they used like the bag and got for a couple minutes, and she did end up, I think it was a minute after she was born or a minute after they started, she took her breath, like first breath on her own. And then they were just kind of sporadic. They weren't, she wasn't breathing consistently. And I think they just kind of spent about 10 minutes working on her and got her pretty stable, but they wanted to bring her to the NICU anyways. They wrapped her up and handed her to me, and I was able to hold her briefly. I gave her to my husband. He was able to hold her a little. And then they went to the NICU, and I stayed behind. Honestly, I thought it was like 20 minutes. Like because I didn't have a phone or anything just until like the placenta was birthed and everything. But I think it was closer to 2 hours, but it really felt like no time. And then I ended up after the 2 hour mark, I was able to go down to the NICU and see her. And they had put her on a CPAP machine. She only needed it like a couple hours, very little. And then within 4 hours of delivery, she was discharged back to our room. So after speaking to like the midwife, like Betty Ann, she had said like it was mostly a precaution type thing. Like she did need help at first, because her APGARs were lower, but then by the 10-minute APGAR score, like it was, I think, a 9. Like she was great, but it was mostly that precaution the hospital wanted to make sure. So they took her to the NICU, but she was doing great right away. And after, I had learned that breech babies, vaginally or C-section, have a harder time getting their first breath. That is very common. So, this isn't something that happened because she was vaginal. This very well could have been the exact same thing if she was C-section. Just a breech baby thing. So, and I knew all of this. So I felt very calm even after she was born. Like I was asking questions and they were answering me about what was happening, what they were doing to her. And my husband was over next to her and touching her and stuff. So yeah, I don't know if that was easy to follow, but that was essentially our birth story.
That was awesome. Okay, I have so many thoughts, even wrote some of them down. So,
Yeah.
how nice that you had such a supportive team that truly gave you all the tools. I mean, it feels like they went above and beyond to truly help you have the birth that you wanted, even though it may not be the norm for all the people who
Mhm.
attended your labor, right? It is very indicative that your room was filled with medical staff,
Mhm.
that this isn't the norm, that this is something they needed to see, that we wanted a lot of our hospital staff to see because it's not something we see a lot. So, that for me, that's the difference, listeners, between a not VBAC, but a breech supportive, like truly supportive environment versus one that's tolerant, that says they're going to help you have your breech baby, but then they do all these things along the way that really try and kind of blockade you. You did not have that. They were truly, truly supportive. When you think back on your birth, you got a lot of emotions coming up here. What are you
Mhm.
feeling? You mentioned like being scared beforehand. I know it's really hard to think about your baby in the NICU. Is there a little bit of pride in there? What kind of things are you feeling a year after your breech?
Oh, yeah. So, like I mentioned, like feeling scared at the contractions, that was more like, knowing the pain was coming for me.
Sure.
But at no point was I afraid because of her being breech. So, like, my midwife was so, um, like, confident isn't the right word. So, like,
Encouraging?
yes, encouraging, but she was so like educated. So
Sure.
like I knew that she knew exactly what to do. Like she was the most experienced person in Canada to deliver a breech baby, and there's a reason. Like she just like it flowed out of her. Like you could tell she knew what she was doing. So there was no part of me that was afraid because she was breech, because I was like, this lady is literally the best person to be in the room with me right now. Like there's nobody better.
Yeah.
So like I feel very, proud of my birth. Like you said, like there is a lot of pride. Um, I hope that, some of those people who did get to see, they'll take that and um like move forward, like hopefully it goes somewhere. Even like I have we took a video of my birth, and it is now being used in Betty Ann's workshops. um she and then I shared it with my original team of midwives, and they shared it, and I was like, you guys show whoever you want. So this is all, they're all allowed, but they shared it with their whole their whole practice. And like my midwife, she came for a home visit after the baby was born. And we played it like up on my TV, and she's like, I have never seen anything so calm, like ever. Like I've never seen any breech birth go this calm. Like everyone was just like, the one midwife was just kind of like sitting on the bed with her hands in her head, like head in her hands, just waiting. Like, and she's like, you see breech deliveries occasionally, but it's always a spontaneous, like we didn't know baby was breech, whatever. And then it's like this emergency and everyone's panicking. And she's like, that room was just like, there was none of that. So that was really cool to hear, you
That's awesome. You're such a badass. Okay, so I have a question about what it
Yep.
feels like to labor with a breech baby versus a baby who is in the traditional head down position. Could you tell a difference in your labor or your contraction strength or pattern or anything that your baby was breech?
So yes, like the laborers were like night and day, and I don't
Oh,
know. I think about this all the time. I don't know if that's because Bailey was a hospital birth and I was in the hospital, or if it's because she was breech. Her labor was very, very intense. With my first, I like, it was home birth, and I afterwards I was like, you know what, like I not at one like not even a single point did I think I couldn't do it, or I needed an epidural, or I needed something else. Like I felt her birth was very manageable the entire time. Like, I was like, that there was points where it was painful, but throughout it, I was able to manage, and I felt like I could do it the whole time. Contractions weren't really that painful for me for my first birth. Then Bailey, I realized why like people get epidurals at that point. Like I didn't want one. I didn't feel like I wanted one, but I understood why people get them because it was a lot of pressure, a lot of pain, and I lost control during transition, and I just felt out of control. Like I was, like I said, I was scared. I was really like just overwhelmed by everything. Like just the pain and how there is people kind of coming in and out at that point trying to where I didn't get that at all with my first. So, and again, I don't know if that's and I don't know if that's the difference between and that's what I think that kind of was the biggest difference for me was just being in the hospital, not her being breech. Because like I said, with my first, I felt all of the contractions in my hips, and I felt that again with Bailey being breech. So it doesn't seem like it really affected the actual like labor because she was breech. I think it was more because of the environment. And again, they tried their hardest to make it everything I wanted. Like it wasn't, obviously I was more comfortable at home. But yeah.
Sure. But you still were able to have an unmedicated breech delivery, which so many people are even too scared to even explore that option, right? So many people are faced with this really fear-based, unsupportive environment from their medical providers that don't even give them the chance to explore this option. So, oh my goodness, Cassidy, your birth story is so inspirational. This story is going to live on forever in my mind. I am so grateful that you shared it with us today. So one last question as we wrap up, and my question is just, is there anything that you would have done differently looking back on your breech birth, or did it truly go as well as it possibly could have, considering in Canada you don't truly have access to home birth breech support?
Honestly, it went in my mind like as best as it could. I think knowing that we did need the peds team and the resuscitation table, I would have probably tried to push harder to bring it closer and for them not to have cut her cord. But again, the table would have needed to be bedside for them not to cut the cord. That is the only thing. But like I wasn't in a position at that time to like really fight it because I was in labor before I even had a chance to talk to anybody, and then I feel like Betty Ann couldn't really push it because they had invited her, right, and she didn't want to make too big of a thing. But look, that's the only thing I would have changed is definitely to have had the table closer because those 10 minutes when she was across the room were awful. But other than that, like the whole everything else was exactly how I envisioned it, and it went exactly how I wanted. So
oh my gosh, that puts such a big smile on my face. You're amazing. You're a badass. You're a rock star. This story is so inspirational. And I really, really appreciate you sharing all of your birth story and your raw emotion and your education. And
I've been crying this whole time, if people can't tell.
I'm so grateful for you sharing this really raw side of birth and postpartum. And I think a lot of people are afraid to show this side. You're going to make me cry. But I think that so many people are afraid to let other humans see us in this raw form. And this is what we need. We need more stories like yours to prove to people you can have the birth that you want. It may just look a little different than what you had first envisioned. This was just absolutely awesome. So is there anything else that you want to leave our crowd with if it comes to, or when it comes to breech birth?
I think like some people, like this story would have sounded scary, especially the ending, her needing to be recessed. But what, like, so I had met with the doctor local, and at no point did he tell me that C-section breech births had the same rate of needing recession as a vaginal. He just kept talking about how dangerous breech birth was compared to head down, which some of his stats weren't quite accurate from what I'd later, like, you know, what I knew. But at no point he compared, you know, a head down to a vaginal breech birth, and he never gave me the stats on C-section breech. So I think, like, you know, people need to realize that, you know, C-section breech births carry risks too. Just if not, well, more than vaginal breech. And doctors aren't really open to sharing that.
Absolutely. You got to do your own digging. You guys, in episode maybe 179, right around the 180 mark, I interview Dr. Rixa Fries, who is the founder of Breech Without Borders. She is awesome. She breaks down the safety of breech birth. We also have home birth breech stories on the podcast and YouTube. So give it a listen. You guys, this community is all about making sure that you understand all of your options, that you truly know that just because one provider is telling you something doesn't mean that that has to be your story. You do have options. You always have options. The important part is that you know what those options are. Cassidy, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been amazing. Your story is so inspirational, and I hope that everyone out there who has never heard of a breech story, who is dealing with a breech baby, or maybe who has had a C-section because they had a breech baby and weren't given other options, finds a little bit of hope and confidence in your story. All right, you guys, I will see you next week on another episode of the Birth Lounge podcast. Until then, take care. Bye. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time on the Birth Lounge podcast. Until then, head over to Instagram and find us at Tranquility by Hihi and give us a follow. You can also check us out at thebirthlounge.com.